hear that noise? It's getting closer.
Yes, Commander. Sounds like heavy armor.
January 1944. The frozen plains of eastern France stretched under a pale winter sun. A low mist clung to the earth, swirling around the skeletal remnants of bombed-out villages. The distant rumble of engines grew steadily louder, a metallic heartbeat shaking the frost-hardened soil. Inside a battered Panther tank, German tankers clutched their controls, eyes narrowing at the horizon. Smoke curled from chimneys of a village long abandoned, mixing with the acrid scent of gunpowder. A distant clatter of treads and the echo of cannon fire approached. At first, it seemed like another scattered Allied patrol. But then they saw the formation, a rolling wave of steel, green-painted in uniform, stretching as far as the eye could see. 100,000 of Shermans. American tanks, mass-produced with relentless efficiency, surged forward without hesitation. Their crews, younger, trained in factories as much as in battlefields, moved with mechanical precision. German hearts sank. The scale, the discipline, the sheer number, it was unlike anything they had encountered. In that moment, a cold, unavoidable truth settled in. The tide of armored warfare had shifted irreversibly. By 1942, the war in Europe had reached a pivotal stage. Germany's blitzkrieg had stormed through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with devastating speed, relying on tightly coordinated panzer divisions and Luftwaffe support. The world had witnessed the dominance of the German Armored Corps, and their reputation as an unstoppable force seemed unshakable. Yet behind the front lines, another battle raged, a race not of bullets and steel alone, but of industrial capacity, logistics, and production. Across the Atlantic, the United States had fully mobilized its economy for war. Factories that once produced consumer goods now churned out tanks, trucks, planes, and munitions at an unprecedented pace. The M4 Sherman tank, named in honor of the Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, became the centerpiece of this effort. Designed for reliability, ease of production, and repairability, the Sherman was not the heaviest or most powerful tank on the battlefield. It was not a Tiger or Panther killer in a direct duel, but it could be produced by the tens of thousands, shipped across oceans, and deployed wherever it was needed. By mid-1943, American factories were producing more than 1,000 Sherman tanks each month. In comparison, Germany struggled to maintain production of its heavier and more technologically advanced tanks. The Tiger I, with its thick armor and 88mm gun, was formidable but complex and expensive. Panthers required precision manufacturing, often delayed by shortages of steel, engines, and skilled labor. Meanwhile, Allied supply chains, fueled by American industrial might, ensured that every Sherman sent into battle was supported by spare parts, fuel, and trained crews. The war was no longer decided solely by the quality of weapons, but by the speed, scale, and consistency of production. Each Sherman rolling off the assembly line represented not just a machine, but the combined effort of thousands of engineers, factory workers, and logisticians. American wartime policy prioritized mass production and standardization, which meant that even if one Sherman was lost in battle, it could be replaced within weeks, sometimes days. On the battlefield, this industrial advantage translated into overwhelming presence. German tank crews had learned to respect the firepower of the Panzer IV, the Panther, and the Tiger. But no single German tank could face a formation of 20 Shermans without risk. And when hundreds of Shermans advanced in coordinated waves, supported by infantry, artillery, and air cover, the scale of the threat became nearly incomprehensible. This period also marked a shift in Allied strategy. Instead of relying solely on elite units or breakthrough operations, the Allies embraced the concept of attrition backed by production. Battles were no longer won just by tactical brilliance or surprise. They were won by sustaining force, maintaining pressure and leveraging numbers. German tankers could fight valiantly, but against the tide of industrially produced Shermans, valor alone could not secure victory. Across the Western Front, the Germans were increasingly aware of this challenge. Intelligence reports noted the proliferation of Shermans, their presence growing in North Africa, Italy, and soon in France. Reconnaissance units reported convoys stretching for miles, carrying tanks, supplies, and fuel, a rolling demonstration of Allied logistical supremacy. German officers debated tactics, attempting to concentrate their panzers for decisive strikes. But the reality was stark. Sheer numbers and unrelenting production made the American Armored Corps an opponent unlike any they had faced before. The Sherman, though outmatched in armor and armament on paper, had become a symbol of the industrial war. It was a machine of mass, coordination, and resilience, built not to dominate a single duel, but to overwhelm an entire battlefield. 4 German tankers. Encountering the first wave was a shock. Realizing that more waves were always coming was a revelation that would redefine their expectations of war. This backdrop, where German armored pride met the unyielding machine of American production, sets the stage for the human experiences, tactical calculations, and technological contrasts that would define the encounters between German crews and the Sherman hordes. By 1943, the German panzer divisions were stretched across multiple fronts. On the Eastern Front, they faced the massive Soviet armored formations. In North Africa, they contended with British and American forces, and in Italy and France, Allied landings loomed on the horizon. German tank design prioritized firepower and armor, producing machines like the Panther and Tiger that could dominate in one-on-one engagements. These tanks, engineered for quality and battlefield supremacy, were expensive, slow to produce, and highly maintenance-intensive. In contrast, the M4 Sherman was designed with a different philosophy: quantity over singular dominance. Weighing around 30 tons, equipped with a 75mm gun, later upgraded variants mounted 76mm or 105mm, and built for reliability, the Sherman could traverse muddy fields, frozen roads, and bombed-out villages where heavier German tanks often faltered. Repair crews could quickly fix or replace its components, ensuring that losses did not translate into permanent battlefield weakness. By the time of the Normandy invasion, the U.S. had produced over 25,000 Shermans, with production accelerating toward 50,000 by war's end. Early encounters between German crews and Shermans offered surprises on both sides. In North Africa, German tankers initially dismissed the Sherman as inferior. Its armor could be penetrated by Panzer IVs or 88mm guns with relative ease. Yet, German reconnaissance underestimated a key factor: numbers and coordination. Shermans were deployed en masse, often in combined arms formations with infantry, artillery, and air support. The Germans quickly realized that even a superior tank could be surrounded, immobilized, and destroyed by coordinated waves of what they had assumed were inferior vehicles. In Italy, during battles along the Gustav Line, German tankers recorded encounters where numerical advantage made the Sherman a formidable opponent despite technical shortcomings. They noted that the Sherman's speed, maneuverability, and ease of repair allowed American forces to sustain offensives even under heavy fire. German tactical manuals began reflecting this reality. Engagement strategies had to account for not just tank-to-tank combat, but also the broader operational context, logistics, reserves, and the seemingly endless stream of Allied armor. Meanwhile, German production lagged behind strategic needs. A Tiger tank required 6 months to build, a Panther around 4 months, and a Panzer for approximately 2. Allied supply chains, on the other hand, produced a Sherman every 7 to 10 days at peak factory output. This disparity created a psychological impact on German crews. Each battle they survived only delayed the inevitable appearance of more Shermans. Reconnaissance reports often showed American columns stretching for miles, a rolling testimony to industrial might. The disparity in production also influenced German strategic decisions. Commanders like Guderian and Model were forced to conserve tanks for decisive battles, avoid attritional engagements, and gamble on ambushes and superior positioning. Yet, even the most carefully planned operations could falter against sheer numbers. When the Allies launched Operation Overlord in June 1944, German armored forces faced a deluge of Shermans backed by unmatched artillery, air superiority, and logistical support. The battlefields of Normandy became a proving ground for the principle that numerical superiority, when combined with reliable technology and supply, could offset the advantages of individual excellence. By late 1944, the psychological and operational impact of Sherman production was undeniable. German tankers and commanders alike faced the sobering reality that no matter how formidable their tanks were, they could not match the relentless flow of American armor. Reports from the front described shock, frustration, and even despair among crews who watched Sherman after Sherman arrived to reinforce positions thought secure. The once dominant panzer divisions were being tested not just in combat, but in endurance against an industrial machine that seemed limitless. Inside the cramped interior of a Panther or Tiger, German tankers faced conditions of relentless tension. The smell of fuel, sweat, and metal filled the cabin. Instruments rattled as engines roared beneath them, and the cold winter air seeped through every seam. Early encounters with Shermans were met with skepticism. After all, the Panzer was a superior machine on paper. Yet, as the Americans advanced in wave after wave, the human experience shifted from cautious confidence to disbelief. German crews were trained for precision, coordination, and tactical excellence. But mass Shermans forced them into attritional fights. One Panther could destroy a dozen Shermans in theory, but the psychological weight of facing continuous reinforcements made each engagement a high-stress scenario. Diaries and reports from the front reflect the mounting anxiety. Crews witnessed destroyed comrades and tanks, only to see more Shermans replace them within days. The relentlessness of this mechanical tide tested morale, eroding confidence in the invincibility of German armored divisions. German commanders had long relied on tactical superiority. Ambushes, terrain advantage, and coordinated strikes were essential to Panzer doctrine. Yet, the arrival of mass-produced Shermans demanded new thinking. Small-scale engagements that once guaranteed victory now risked total annihilation. Shermans were not individually superior in firepower, but their numbers allowed for saturation tactics. The Allies deployed tanks in overlapping fields, supported by artillery and air cover, creating an operational depth that German forces struggled to penetrate. German tankers were forced to adapt. Defensive formations, kill zones, and night maneuvers became standard practice. Yet, even with careful planning, German forces often found themselves outnumbered, surrounded, and forced into withdrawal. Battles that might have been tactical victories turned into Pyrrhic struggles. The Sherman's design reflected American industrial philosophy: reliability, repairability, and adaptability over raw power. Its 75mm gun could not penetrate a Panther's front armor at medium range, but flanking shots were lethal. Its mobility allowed it to exploit terrain where heavier German tanks bogged down, and damaged Shermans were quickly returned to service. German tank technology, epitomized by the Tiger Eye's 88mm gun and Panther's sloped armor, was optimized for battlefield supremacy, but not for mass deployment. Each German tank was a marvel of engineering, but production bottlenecks and maintenance demands limited numbers on the front lines. The Sherman, simple by comparison, proved deadly in coordination, numbers, and persistence. German crews quickly recognized a painful truth. Technical superiority was not enough when faced with endless reinforcements and an armored machine that could absorb losses without faltering. For American military leaders, the M4 Sherman was a triumph of industrial foresight as much as battlefield design. Figures like General George C. Marshall and Major General Leslie McNair understood that the war would be won not only by elite units, but by sustaining a constant flow of reliable armored vehicles. Production schedules were meticulously planned, assembly lines optimized, and supply chains secured. Every Sherman tank rolling off the production line represented not just hardware, but a strategic statement. The Allies could replace losses faster than the Axis could inflict them. This approach contrasted sharply with German leadership. High-ranking officers like Heinz Guderian and Walter Model recognized the tactical brilliance of their armored corps, but faced the impossible reality of production constraints. They could design tanks superior to the Sherman, but when only a few hundred were available to meet thousands of Shermans on the battlefield, brilliance alone could not prevail. Decisions became a calculus of attrition, forcing German leaders to gamble on concentrated strikes and ambushes rather than sustained offensives. German intelligence initially underestimated the Sherman. Field reports described the tank as lightly armored and undergunned, a vehicle that should have been easily destroyed in direct engagements. However, repeated encounters demonstrated a different reality. The Germans observed American crews working efficiently, coordinating with artillery and infantry, and sustaining relentless pressure despite casualties. Tank commanders reported their surprise at the sheer volume of Shermans on the front. Encounters that should have ended in quick victories turned into exhausting battles of attrition. One report from Normandy noted, "No matter how many we destroy, they keep coming. Their numbers are endless, and their persistence unyielding." This assessment marked a shift in German strategy. The Sherman was no longer seen as an inferior tank, but as a weapon of industrial warfare. Its power lay not in technical specifications, but in volume, coordination, and sustainment. The human cost of confronting mass-produced Shermans weighed heavily on German crews. Fear and fatigue became constant companions. Each encounter underscored the vulnerability of even the most elite panzer divisions. Psychological reports from the front describe how tankers, once confident in their superior machinery, grew increasingly wary of engagements that involved more than a handful of Shermans. The sight of waves of green-painted tanks moving inexorably across fields and villages inflicted a unique kind of terror. It was not just the loss of comrades, but the realization that human skill and bravery could not counter the industrial might behind the Sherman. Soldiers felt the strain of an unwinnable equation. For every German tank destroyed, a dozen Shermans were waiting in reserve, ready to take its place. This shift in perception foreshadowed the operational turning points to come, where numbers and logistics would outmatch technical superiority and battlefield cunning. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy were shrouded in smoke and fog, the morning sun struggling to pierce the gray sky. Thousands of Allied troops surged onto the sand, but behind them, a rolling tide of steel approached. M4 Sherman tanks, green-painted in uniform, advancing across the bocage with precision. 4 German tankers, the scale was staggering. Entire panzer divisions, once considered elite and invincible, now faced an armored wave unlike any in history. The Battle of Normandy quickly became a test of industrial might versus tactical expertise. German commanders, including General Heinrich Eberbach of the Panzerlehr Division, concentrated their forces near Cannes, deploying Tigers and Panthers in defensive pockets designed to halt the Allied advance. On paper, these tanks could destroy Shermans at long range. In practice, the massed numbers, maneuverability, and coordination of American armor overwhelmed every defensive plan. On July 18th, during Operation Goodwood, over 1,000 Shermans advanced toward Cannes in tightly coordinated columns. The Germans unleashed every available heavy tank, artillery barrage, and anti-tank position. Yet the sheer volume of Shermans diluted the impact of German fire. Panthers destroyed dozens. Tigers picked off dozens more. But the Americans pressed on, repairs were swift, and reinforcements filled every gap. German tankers, watching from hilltops and behind hedgerows, began to understand the futility of isolated heroics. Even the open fields, tactical brilliance struggled against relentless numbers. German crews reported engaging 5 or 6 Shermans at a time, only to find themselves encircled by dozens more advancing from flanking positions. Communications jammed with frantic calls for support that could not arrive in time. Each destroyed Sherman seemed immediately replaced by another, eroding morale and forcing German units into defensive postures. Beyond Normandy, the pattern repeated across Western Europe. During Operation Cobra, the American breakout from St. Lo, Sherman's spearheaded assaults across cratered roads and shell-pocked fields. German counterattacks, often led by elite Panther units, inflicted losses but could not stop the armored tide. Commanders recorded the chilling reality. Numerical advantage and logistical superiority allowed the Allies to absorb tactical failures and maintain offensive momentum. The decisive realization for German tankers was not technical inferiority, it was endurance. No single battle could halt the Sherman advance. Even when a Panther or Tiger destroyed 10 enemy tanks, 24 more were ready to take their place. Each encounter reinforced a sobering truth. The war had shifted from individual tank duels to a contest of sustained production, logistics, and relentless operational pressure. By late July 1944, the psychological turning point had been reached. German crews, exhausted by continuous engagements, faced the dual challenges of material scarcity and the unstoppable flow of Shermans. Officers noted that morale, once a source of pride and cohesion, now became a liability under unrelenting pressure. Casualty reports from panzer divisions frequently mentioned the fear of being outnumbered rather than being outgunned, highlighting a fundamental shift in armored warfare. Quantity, organization, and endurance now defined battlefield success. This convergence of strategy, technology, and human endurance set the stage for the final phase of armored confrontations in Western Europe. The German belief in the invincibility of their Panzer Corps had been shaken. The Sherman, mass-produced, reliable, and relentlessly deployed, had become the instrument of industrial warfare, the unstoppable tide that German tankers could not ignore. August 25, 1944. The streets of Paris were alive with tension. German panzer units, battered from weeks of relentless engagement in Normandy, attempted to regroup and hold a defensive line against advancing Allied forces. Shermans, ever present in massive formations, moved with calculated precision, supported by infantry, artillery, and air reconnaissance. German tankers could feel the culmination of months of attritional warfare, the reality of being outnumbered and outpaced in both production and logistics. In the Falaise pocket, a critical turning point unfolded. German commanders concentrated their remaining armored strength in a desperate bid to break through encircling Allied forces. Panthers and Tigers formed defensive clusters, hoping to repel the advancing Shermans. Yet, the Americans had learned from earlier engagements. Sherman units were coordinated to cover each other's flanks, avoid kill zones, and exploit terrain advantage. German tanks destroyed dozens of Shermans, but reinforcements filled every gap. The pocket closed like a vice. Thousands of German soldiers and dozens of tanks were trapped, while Shermans poured in from multiple directions, sealing the encirclement. This decisive moment exposed the strategic consequences of American industrial capacity. For every German tank lost, dozens of Shermans remained operational. The Germans could no longer rely on technical superiority or tactical ingenuity to regain the initiative. Commanders on the ground acknowledged a harsh truth. No matter how skilled or brave, individual panzer units could not stem the tide of an armored army produced and maintained on an industrial scale. At the same time, battlefield reports from the Western Front highlighted this psychological impact. German crews, once confident in their ability to hold or counterattack, were demoralized by the sheer persistence of Sherman formations. Witnessing successive waves of tanks advancing despite losses created a pervasive sense of inevitability. Letters and diaries from German tankers reveal a mixture of awe, frustration, and resignation, an unspoken recognition that the Sherman was more than a tank. It was a manifestation of American industrial and logistical dominance. Elsewhere, in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, the Sherman again proved decisive. German units launched a surprise offensive, hoping to exploit winter conditions and logistical gaps. For a brief moment, panzer divisions regained some initiative, destroying Shermans in skirmishes and advancing into key positions. Yet, American supply lines, factory-backed replacements, and coordinated counterattacks quickly neutralized these gains. Shermans arrived in numbers that German commanders could neither predict nor counter effectively. Even heavy tanks like the Tiger II could not reverse the momentum. Attrition, exhaustion, and industrial imbalance dictated the outcome. By late 1944, German tankers' disbelief had transformed into grim acceptance. The Sherman was no longer an opponent in the traditional sense. It was an embodiment of a war fought as much in factories as on the battlefield. Each battle reinforced the lesson. Technical excellence could not substitute for production scale, logistical support, and tactical coordination. German armored forces, once feared and respected across Europe, now contended with a relentless machine whose power lay not in individual supremacy, but in persistent, overwhelming presence. The cumulative effect of these turning points sealed the fate of German armored resistance. Normandy, Falaise, and the Ardennes collectively demonstrated that the Sherman's true strength was endurance and replication. German tankers, witnessing their panzer divisions being steadily outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and replaced, confronted the stark reality of industrial warfare. The battle had shifted irreversibly in favor of the Allies. By late 1944, the cumulative effect of Sherman tank production and deployment had reshaped the European battlefield. German panzer divisions, once symbols of armored supremacy, were now severely depleted. Operational reports documented the loss of hundreds of Tigers and Panthers, and a strain on German logistics grew critical. Fuel shortages, spare parts scarcity, and personnel fatigue compounded the battlefield losses, making it impossible to mount sustained counterattacks against the relentless waves of Shermans. Casualty figures illustrate the scale of this attritional war. In Normandy alone, German armored units lost more than 1,500 tanks over 3 months of engagement. American forces, by contrast, replaced destroyed Shermans with remarkable speed. Factory production, combined with efficient supply chains, allowed the Allies to maintain numerical superiority in tanks, armored vehicles, and mechanized infantry. The war was no longer a contest of individual tactical victories. It had become a contest of endurance, production, and logistics. German tankers frequently noted the psychological toll in diaries and after-action reports. One Panther crewman wrote, "We could destroy their tanks, but the field never emptied. For every Sherman we knocked out, 2 more appeared. We were fighting shadows of the same machine, unending. Morale, once a strength of German armored forces, eroded under the relentless pressure of industrial-scale warfare. Leaders struggled to maintain cohesion, knowing that even the most skilled units could not reverse the imbalance. Strategically, the mass production of Shermans allowed the Allies to sustain multiple simultaneous offensives. Operations like Cobra, Goodwood, and the breakout from St. Lo relied on overwhelming armor numbers to suppress German defenses and exploit weaknesses. The ability to commit hundreds of tanks to a single engagement meant that American commanders could absorb losses without jeopardizing the overall campaign. The Sherman was not just a weapon. It was a strategic instrument, enabling operational flexibility that German forces could no longer match. This shift in battlefield dynamics marked a broader transformation in warfare. German panzer divisions had once relied on shock, precision, and technical superiority to dominate engagements. The introduction of mass-produced Shermans rendered these advantages less decisive. Individual skill and elite machinery could not counterbalance a sustained flow of reliable, well-supported tanks. The battlefield had become a theater where industrial capacity dictated tactical possibilities and strategic outcomes. The erosion of German armored strength was evident not only in numbers, but in operational planning. Commanders began to avoid open engagements with Sherman-heavy formations, favoring defensive positions, ambushes, and delaying tactics. German units were forced into reactive maneuvers, constantly adjusting to the overwhelming presence of Allied armor. The once dominant doctrine of concentrated armored thrusts gave way to a struggle for survival against a numerically superior opponent whose strength was rooted in factories, not just battlefield performance. This context sets the stage for Aftermath, Section 2, where we will examine the long-term consequences, the complete impact on German armored capabilities, detailed losses, strategic shifts, and the enduring legacy of the Sherman's industrial supremacy. By early 1945, the impact of Sherman proliferation on German armored forces was unmistakable. German panzer divisions, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, were shadows of their former selves. Factory production of German tanks could not keep pace with losses inflicted by the relentless Sherman offensives. Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs became rare, carefully rationed, and often reserved for defensive last stands rather than offensive operations. In contrast, American forces continued to deploy Shermans by the hundreds, sustaining operational momentum across France, the Low Countries, and into Germany itself. Quantitatively, the numbers tell the story. By war's end, the United States had produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks, while Germany struggled to deploy roughly 6,000 heavy and medium tanks combined during the same period. Even elite formations could not overcome this imbalance. The disparity was compounded by logistics. Shermans were easier to maintain, repair, and transport, allowing American armored units to remain combat-ready even after heavy losses. German units faced shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, rendering many tanks immobile and forcing crews into increasingly desperate defensive actions. The strategic consequences were equally profound. German command recognized that large-scale counteroffensives were increasingly futile. In battles across the Western Front, the Germans were relegated to delaying maneuvers, fortified positions, and piecemeal engagements designed to slow the advance rather than stop it. The massive Shermans allowed the Allies to maintain unbroken pressure, systematically dismantling German defensive lines and forcing retreats toward the Rhine. Report from the field emphasized the morale collapse. Seasoned panzer crews expressed frustration and disbelief at being outnumbered so consistently. Beyond the battlefield, the Sherman's impact reshaped perceptions of armored warfare. German military analysts concluded that future conflicts could not rely solely on technical superiority. Industrial scale, standardization, and logistical efficiency had become decisive factors. The Sherman demonstrated that a moderately armed, reliable tank, when produced en masse and supported by robust supply chains, could dominate technically superior but numerically inferior opponents. This principle influenced post-war tank development and military doctrine worldwide. Human cost and psychological effect were equally significant. German tankers witnessed the relentless replacement of lost vehicles, and the sight of yet another wave of Shermans arriving in seemingly endless succession became a defining trauma of the late war. Diaries and memoirs recount feelings of inevitability, a recognition that bravery and skill could only delay, not prevent, the relentless advance. Sherman production had not just destroyed tanks. It had eroded the confidence and cohesion of German armored forces, leaving a psychological imprint as deep as any physical loss. As the Allies pushed into Germany, the cumulative impact of Sherman deployment ensured that the Wehrmacht's armored resistance could not regroup or mount effective counteroffensives. The once mighty panzer divisions, symbols of German battlefield dominance, were overwhelmed by an industrial army whose strength lay not in the individual tank, but in the hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of machines marching in unbroken, mechanized waves. The story of the Sherman tank is not just a tale of steel and firepower. It is a testament to the industrial dimension of modern warfare. The M4 Sherman, produced in tens of thousands, demonstrated that wars could be won as much in factories as on battlefields. 4 German tankers. Encountering wave after wave of these tanks was a revelation. Technical superiority alone could not dictate outcomes when faced with relentless production and logistical efficiency. The Sherman's legacy extends beyond its performance in any single engagement. It reshaped the calculus of armored warfare, proving that reliability, repairability, and sheer numbers could counter heavier, more powerful adversaries. It was a machine built not for glory in duels, but for endurance, persistence, and adaptability, qualities that transformed entire campaigns. Commanders, soldiers, and historians alike recognize that its impact was as psychological as it was physical. The German crew's disbelief, frustration, and eventual resignation underscore a profound lesson. In total war, industrial capacity becomes a decisive weapon. Moreover, the Sherman symbolizes the human effort behind war production. Every tank reflected the work of engineers, factory laborers, and logisticians whose contributions directly influenced the course of history. The relentless output of Shermans ensured that the Allies could sustain momentum, absorb losses, and maintain operational pressure, changing the nature of military strategy and setting a precedent for post-war armor doctrine worldwide. Ultimately, the story of a Sherman is a story of scale, endurance, and inevitability. It is a reminder that in war, victory is often determined not by the brilliance of a single machine or the courage of individual crews, but by the capacity to persist, to replace, and to overwhelm. 4 German tankers. The moment of shock when facing 50,000 Shermans was the moment they understood this fundamental truth. History remembers the Sherman not merely as a tank, but as the embodiment of industrial warfare, an unstoppable tide that reshaped the battlefield and, in doing so, changed the world.